All right, everyone. Welcome back to another conversation I get to have, which I feel very blessed and very lucky to have. Conversations with not just experts in the field of esotericism and Gnosticism, but in this case, a person who's really written the book on, I think, one of the most mysterious and ironically, one of the least appreciated Gnostic groups of Gnostic texts, despite the fact that they're the oldest known Gnostic text, at least in contemporary modern Europe. But thank you so much for taking the time, Erin, to come hang out with me and talk a little bit about um, the Uins or the Yoians. We'll have to sort out how you'll have to let me know how to pronounce it correctly. So many vowels in there.
Many vowels.
Many
Thank you for
vowels.
having me here. I'm really glad to be here, and I'm glad that somebody managed to obtain a copy from Brill.
I just had to like sell a kidney. That's the joke around here. Is that you're just kind of to sell organs to get Braille books. I think that between your book and the actual book itself, the McDermott, if you want to get both of them fresh off the Braille presses, it's about €300 or something like that. Um, which people know my opinion about that and how we treasure accessibility here as Esoterica, and that is not financially accessible to most people. So it's also really great to be able to bring you on because you are the walking book. So could you just introduce us a little bit to yourself and your work and sort of yeah, you and your work and what you've studied and
Yeah, sure. So, well, my name is Erin EvansWalker, or Erin Evans as it was at the time I wrote the book. It's been a little while. So I did my master's and PhD on this subject at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, around about 2012. Um, yeah, came to this particular subject with a general interest in Gnosticism, having done a couple of classes as an undergrad in uh, the Bible as literature, and just gradually learning about non-canonical texts that existed that I hadn't known growing up, becoming fascinated in the genre, and I thought, well, I'm going to study this further. Had not heard of the Books of Jeu. I had heard of the Pistis Sophia, at least in passing, and thought it looked interesting, but far too intimidating to actually pick up and research. But it was in an oddly non-academic context that I found just a brief reference to the Books of Jeu, and I was like, "Oh, that sounds really interesting." I dug up the interlibrary loaned a copy of it because the university didn't have one at the time. Um, Discovered how closely connected it was to the Pistis Sophia, and realized I had found what I wanted to devote my time to researching for the next several years.
And it's amazing. You really the volume you authored is really I think a really amazing piece of scholarship. I deeply appreciate it, and it's interesting that your university did not even have a copy of this text, which is again, I imagine it had a dozen copies of the Nag Hammadi library and maybe even facsimiles of the Nag Hammadi library. And this is an interesting thing about the Books of Jeu and to a lesser degree the Pistis Sophia is that despite the fact that they're among the earliest texts that we've recovered of Gnosticism and all the fraughtness that comes along with that category, it's interesting that they are so understudied. So much so that even getting a copy you had to ILL from another university library, there's something a bit hilarious to me about that. Um, but let's just back up a little bit and talk about the sort of with all the fraughtness and all the caveats that come along with talking about Gnosticism as a category, which everyone knows we beat that category hard around here, and rightly so. But what can you say about the Uians? Most people have heard of, at least around here, have heard of Sethians and maybe Ophites or Carpocratians, even those weirdos. But the Uians, I think, are the ones who are really the odd Gnostics out. What are they, and sort of what's the literature associated with them?
Well, so if we view Gnosticism as a whole as being focused on knowledge and requiring special knowledge to sort of achieve salvation or escape from the world, depending on what sort of view you're coming to, then the Uians are pretty firmly in the Gnostic category, because the first and second book of Jeu are almost entirely focused on imparting knowledge that initiate would need to progress through the lower Aeons, and then through the treasuries of light, and ultimately to reach the presence of the true God that awaits in the middle of at all. So who are the Uien? Well, the name Uien I coined just
Mm-hmm.
for lack of there being a word for them back when they were. So they were originally brought to the West in, I think, the late 18th century and were gradually sort of written about over the course of the 19th century primarily, and then in sort of the 20s and 30s. And then when the Nag Hammadi texts were found, they were sort of forgotten on a shelf. But given the fact that there wasn't a lot of other material to compare them with, scholars at the time just sort of assumed that these weird texts must be one of the Gnostic groups that have been referred to in one of the heresiological texts. So they must be the Barbelloites because Barbello was mentioned once or twice, or they must be Valentinian because the Valentinians were a big group. And they were sort of pointed at them and say, oh, look how ridiculous and convoluted these Gnostics were. The heresiologists were right all along to pan these groups. But from my perspective, they're sort of not one of the ones that is covered in one of the big heresiological texts, and can be looked at in their own right. So in terms of what books constitute the Uien texts, it's two of the books and a couple of fragments from the Bruce Codex, which have been sort of colloquially called the Books of Jeu, because the figure Jeu is the main god sort of named in those texts, and also because the text of the Pistis Sophia, which would be the other main evidence we have of this group, refers to two Books of Jeu in one of those volumes. So earlier scholars picked up on the fact that the Pistis Sophia mentions Books of Jeu and figured out, well, these books that talk about Jeu a lot must be them. Yes, so we've got in the Books of Jeu themselves, we've got largely sort of ritual manuals. There are detailed descriptions of baptismal rituals, as well as detailed descriptions of how to pass through the sort of material Aeons and then onward through the Treasuries, which I speculate to be a sort of celestial realm. And then you've also got in the Pistis Sophia texts something that's perhaps a bit more early initiate facing. There's more of a mythological presentation, a discussion of sins to avoid and the kind of lifestyle you should live. So that's sort of lower level preparing yourself, and then the ritual text of the Books of Jeu would be once you've sort of lived that life for a while and are considered prepared to undergo these rituals and learn that knowledge.
Right. And I think when you say that earlier, you said it's really Gnostic simplicator in the sense that it really is knowledge. It's kind of like even not just Gnosis in some kind of abstract, broad sense, but it's really just facts. Like you need to know the number to put on the
That's
stone
right.
that you need to hold and the direction to face and the word to say. It's Gnostic in the sense of like, I don't know, like you need to memorize a bunch of stuff or
It's
at least have someone being able to guide you through it. So when I think that you're really keen to notice that it's not just, oh, the world is evil and made by a bad demiurge and you need to follow the spiritual path out of here.
no,
There are very particular things that you need to do to be able to it's very video game like in a certain kind of way.
it is a bit, and I think it is also worth noting that you're very right. The world isn't just evil and you need to escape it. I mean, this does sort of posit that all of creation is created by a generally positive demiurge. It's not an escaping; it's just a fact of life that you want to move on beyond this world when the time comes.
Yeah, and only I think only the five lower aeons are actually malevolent at all, and in some of the upper ones in the path are they rejoice in the fact that you're bypassing them. They're happy in the fact that you're getting out of dodge.
That's
So
right.
yeah, it's a really lovely image that the five ones are kind of mini bosses, and once you get past those, it's things get okay at toward the upper reaches, and the
They get
Watchers and stuff and the Treasury is a little scary, but they're not malevolent, and the world's never described in the Uien text, although maybe a little bit in that very first section in First U, which I think, and maybe I'd like to hear your thinking of that. It seems like a bit of a tacked on the sort of introductory sermon that Jesus gives at the very beginning.
Mhm.
It does kind of describe the world as a little bad, but I think you're right that it's not the world of some malformed demiurge in the way we see in the Apocryphon of John or something.
The sort of introductory sermon that the repeated couple of pages from Jesus, I would actually argue isn't even part of the Jeuian corpus, in part because it uses different language to talk about Jesus and to talk about the disciples. It refers to them, it's the only place in these books to talk about them as apostles rather than as the disciples. Um, so I would argue that those are even a separate thing. Don't want to go.
In the time in Second U, where you do see him referring to as the disciples, it's the male and female disciples,
That's right.
Which is a markedly different tone than Gospel of Thomas
Yes.
stuff, where I'll make her male to da 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 da.
Sure.
It's a markedly different tone gender wise in that, which again I think is
It is largely gender inclusive, even in terms of needing to leave behind your um, fathers and sons and wives, and it's all gender inclusive in that regard.
yeah. I think, and again, this is just more grist for the mill that this text really is worthy of study, which is an argument I'm going to make when the episode goes live. Is that that this text is really understudied, underappreciated, and it really is fascinating in its own right. Whether you're coming at it from a Gnosticism angle or an ancient magic angle, or Ascent literature, which I'm very interested in when it comes to things like Merkava literature, ancient mystical Ascent literature.
Sure.
The books of you get all of it, and that's what's really cool about them. Is you really get, if you're into the magic stuff, there's the kind of quasi Greco-Egyptian magic stuff that's in there as well. So what led you to specifically studying this material? Why the books of you and the Pistis Sophia, especially considering that the Pistis Sophia, as you mentioned, that's a beast of a text. It is really the most, to me, it's the most intimidating text. Let me make sure I want to put it correctly. It may be the most intimidating text, with the exception of a really fragmentary text like Zostrianos. It may be the most intimidating text ever produced in that entire milieu, whether it's Hermetic, Gnostic, what we have little of the Manichaeans. Some Mandean texts are pretty intimidating. But I would say Pistis Sophia probably is the most intimidating, just in terms of how much it covers and how huge it is as a text. But why did you take the bull by the horns and really dive into these incredibly technical, incredibly lengthy, and perplexing, often, frankly, very perplexing texts? Aside from the challenge of it, or preparing a very elaborate Dungeons and Dragons game, what plunged you into these texts?
I would say, I mean, it is like you said a little bit. There's a certain feel of it's almost like a video game. It's a puzzle to be solved, and there's mysteries to be uncovered. And the fact that so little had been written about them sort of gave me the freedom to look into them as I saw fit, and read the couple of paragraphs that were inserted into the essentially polemical analyses of them 100 years ago that are like, yeah, it's proof that these Gnostics were decadent and had no moral value. But I had the perspective that no, there are interesting references in here, and there are sort of judgments you can try to, or connections you can try to make with the cultural milieu using the astrology of the day, looking at the sort of Egyptian context and viewing it as something that could be coherent, even if some errors have crept in here and there in transcription. I think that the fact that there's evidence that, I mean, this was not just one guy who wrote some stuff in a cave and it was just him, that there may have been multiple copies over time, that it may be a translation. All of that sort of bespoke some fruitful ground to at least look some. And with Pistis Sophia, the fact that the ending bit is so closely tied to the Books of Jeu, that was what sort of made me say, okay, I need to look at them both. And they really do come together. They share a lot of the same cast of characters. They share the same unique cosmology, and yeah, there was just a lot to look at, and it sparked my imagination a little bit.
I mean, that's a great thing to hear, right? Is that it's sort of like I climbed the mountain because it was there. I did it because it was hard, like it was tough and weird, and but that's like the most inspiring thing for me. It's like, that you weren't you took the text that was the least fashionable at some level, and I want to come back to that in a minute, and you did the hard work to make it accessible and give a scholarly analysis of it, and you didn't. I was even reading the Vanderbroek text, which was one of my favorite for Gnosticism in a general way. And there's a moment in his summary of it where he just more or less says, "And this text has been not very much studied." I'm like, that's a weird thing to say for a scholar. Like that seems like a signpost that you might want to go do that. And the fact that
It's
you
sort
did
of,
that is incredibly commendable.
I mean, it's
Um,
academic gold dust, more or less, to when you're trying to find something new to contribute to human knowledge. The thing that nobody's looked at in 100 years seems like a good place to maybe think about starting.
well, yeah, that seems like a completely reasonable thing to me. But academic fashion is what academic fashion is, and it's amazing how much fashion can drive the industry in very unfortunate ways, at least to my mind. Um, this is a question I want to get at in a little bit more, and I have a theory about it. I'm going to talk about it in the episode. Um, why do you think the text, aside from just sort of the flash in the not flash in the pan, but the big explosion of Nagamati, that's obviously one part of it, but there is and you've seen this as well, that there's a constant denigration of these texts by scholars, that they call them decadent. They call them Gnosticism run wild, which is sort of like the most hilarious. I imagine like a bunch of like Gnostics on spring break, just like, let's just make a bunch of Aeons, man. Just like, let's just do it. And so the text gets called barbaric and all kinds of it's really weird to see scholars who are otherwise very sober Germans, just throwing throwing shade at these texts, um, which frankly they're not any more barbaric than, I don't know, Zostrianos with all of its insanity, or Marsenes, or any of the other texts like this. But do you have any sense about why why these texts have earned this kind of derision?
Well, I think part of that was just the product of the era in which they were being studied. I think that in more recent decades, people are a little bit more open to studying things in their own sort of cultural context and not coming at it from a sort of Christian centric scholarly background. Like some of these people, earlier scholars, viewed it as, oh, well, obviously these have just come from Christianity and they've just spiraled so far out of control that they've lost all of the morality that would have originally been had in the true religion from which it sort of spiraled off from.
Mm-hmm.
Now, and especially with the finding of these other texts, and people are a bit more open to, okay, there was more than just mainstream Christianity. There was more than just mainstream Judaism. There's more than just the sort of mainstream Roman rule. There were there was a marketplace of ideas, and different people were worshipping or practicing in different ways, and you can sort of look at that in their own light, and without the baggage of trying to tie it all into the apostolic fathers and that kind of cultural background.
Yeah, I think that makes a ton of sense to me. Um, and I think that for me, I guess one of the things that strikes me as maybe another thing that's kind of earned these texts a little bit of unwarranted uh, shade is that I think the close connection they have to the world of Greco-Egyptian magic. And I think that there was
Mhm.
the days of Presendance and in that world, those texts were all the Greek magical papyri were kind of viewed as, backwards and decadent, and
Mhm.
these people were illiterate or stupid, which is ironic considering that they wrote a whole bunch of stuff that scholars have to edit that are perfectly literate, and quite complicated, which is again the weird ironies that come along with academic I don't know, hubris. But and this is the thing I think maybe many people don't realize, is that the Books of Jeu are the only preserved Gnostic texts with illustrations in them.
Yes.
And those illustrations, and we'll come back to those when we talk about the treasuries in just a second, but many of those are quasi magical, I might say, something like
Mm.
that. Or at least they're images of ritual power. Maybe we can
Sure.
put that in a more neutral language. But I think that when you crack the manuscript open, as much as people cracked it open, and they saw these weird diagrams, they're like, "Whoops, magic! This is bad." And maybe
Mm.
that has a part of it. It just sort of got grouped in with the Greek magical papyri, or and it wasn't thought of as high philosophy the way
Yeah.
that we think of something else. Um, the Hermetic text we think of as philosophical, right?
Sure.
Um, Something like that. I don't
Uh,
know.
Yes, I did find it interesting. So when I was starting to study these, and the Books of Jeu and the Pistis Sophia were both out of print with Brill, but the Nag Hammadi library books all featured Books of Jeu symbols on their spines.
That's
Uh,
that's
they're
right.
not included in the library, but they included the symbols on there. Like, oh, these are Gnostics. So just put some Gnostic stuff on there.
That's hilarious that they would be on the spine and yet not. Yeah. Um,
Yeah, you can kind of see. Ah, where's my?
no, yeah. It's some of the. It's the. It's the character
Yeah,
of the highest one of
I
the
think that's
60th one, I think.
yeah.
Yep. Yeah, I really try to go through these texts and try to memorize, like, trying to see patterns and things like that. It's really tough, but that's the one that's clearly 12. It's divided into 12, and it's the most
Yeah.
zodiacal, I think.
Mhm.
Which I think is really grist for the mill of a very. I'll be reconstructing part of your argument in the episode, but I think that I'm very convinced by your analysis of the book of 1U that we're talking about. Um, we're looking at the heavens in the text. I think that's a very compelling argument you make. I really appreciated those moves, um, which is neat because it gives you kind of a neat isomorphic system, right? Where there's kind of a metaphysical emanation of the world through the small
Mhm.
idea and then out through the various treasuries. But
Mhm.
also, that's also the physical world. And it really blurs the line between what is physical and what is metaphysical in a way
Mhm.
that really disrupts a lot of uh, classical ideas we have about Gnosticism, about, again, the world being a malevolent evil, but matter being an evil kind of thing.
Sure.
So I think that's a really lovely read of that text, and really, um, yeah, it really does that well. So speaking of these treasuries and things, what are some of the standout elements about the Uian texts? Many folks that are watching the channel, they've had some Apocryphon of John, they know some Valentinus, um, but what are some of the standout elements in these Uian texts to your mind?
Sure. Well, I think that one of the most iconic things is the unique cosmology that it has. So, uh, different books within the group present them in slightly different ways, but the broad categories stay more or less the same. So, there's the treasuries of light, which are sometimes called the places of the right. There's the places of the left, which are also called the midst or the outer darkness, and those are sort of regions of punishment. Those only appear in some of the Pistis Sophia texts, not in the Books of Jeu. And then there's another midst, which sort of is between the places of the right and the places of the left, and that's kind of the neutral ground uh, barrier just outside of entering the heavenly realms from the lower sort of sublunar and planetary spheres, um,
Right.
in my
And
view.
so if folks want to imagine it, right, where if you're, and it's hard to do, right, because when I was actually thinking about writing the episode, and I'm still writing the episode literally right now, I'll go back to writing it when we're done talking. There was really a debate in my mind about whether I start from the unknowable God and go down,
Mm-hmm.
or start at kind of where we are and go up.
Yeah.
And I ultimately ended up following the path of the text, but but um, on your read of the text, right, what we're looking at is a system of aeons going up from the Earth, and this is a geocentric worldview.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and you divide there's 12 of those aeons, right? And I think you speculate that
There's,
there are 5 sublunar ones and then 7 going up.
I mean, technically speaking, there's 13 aeons,
Oh,
and
that's right. Or
this,
even
the second book
14,
of
kind
you
of.
also. The second book of you mentions a 14th aeon, but I think that may be an example of some confusion slipping in, because
Mhm.
that's not featured in any of the other texts, whereas the 13th aeon is.
Right.
But yes, so basically you've got in the second book of you, when it's doing the sort of guided tour of the aeons, you've got the first 5, and when you show the signs and seals, the archons there sort of get upset and they flee to the west and to the left. And then when you get to the 6th aeon, which I believe is described as the home of Yao, the little, the good,
Mhm.
um, they rejoice. And then after that, for aeon 7 through 12, it's just sort of neutral passage. And then the 13th aeon is described as the place where the triple powered ones reside, and they
Mhm.
are the only non-human entities that are described as one day being allowed entry into the treasuries of light, because they will receive the mystery of the forgiveness of sins. Um, but it's sort of that waiting area just outside.
And if you're imagining that in the solar, like in our solar system, that's like right the edge right before the stars begin, right? The fixed stars. Like it'll be
Presumably.
presumably, yeah, as much as we can kind of speculate about any of this stuff. And it's also interesting that some of the more familiar archons that folks will know, right, like Yaldabaoth and Adamas, they're down there in the five. But I think what's interesting and something we were talking about before we went live is that the Uins seem to have some beef with the Sethians, right? They seem to have been arguing with the Sethians. And could you tell us a little bit about what the Uins do, maybe to put their thumb in the eye of the Sethians a little bit?
I don't even know if it's a beef at this stage. I would argue that in the Pistis Sophia myth itself, it seems pretty clear that they're actively denigrating these beings. From the second book of Jeu, it's difficult to tell if they just encountered this popular idea of this trinity of beings. They're like, well, that doesn't quite fit in with our true God, but we'll put them into the cosmology. They're just down here in the Aeons of the material realm. So you've got your Barbello and the invisible god and the unbegotten one camped out in that lower Aeonic realm.
And they're in the I can't remember. They're in the 12th Aeon. Is that right?
The 12th Aeon, and it's the triple powered ones that are in the
13th, right? And the triple power ones also appear in other Gnostic texts too, right?
They do.
Are they all are they also Sethian or are they
I think that
Montanian?
they are.
Yeah.
Yes.
So yeah, you may be right. It may be just a case that like it's a pretty serious demotion though, right?
Oh,
They go
yeah.
from the tip of the whole business, the whole inventory scheme to
Sure.
being one stuck in the material world, which
Yeah.
is really not a thing for the Sethians.
No.
And then there's 60 tiers above
Higher
them,
than-
higher than them.
they yeah.
And
They
can you describe to us one of these treasuries? I'll be going into a little bit degree detail, and I love the illustration you give to highlight one of these treasuries. But can you just describe so we get out of the world of the solar system, right, and we're in the world of stars presumably, and the
Mhm.
world of stars is filled with these 60 treasuries, which may track to like poles of the cosmos, right? The five poles of the five kind of layers of the cosmos that maybe.
Mhm.
What does a sort of a general treasury look like? If you were walking into a treasury,
If you're walking into a treasury,
what would you see?
well, you're gonna find some gates, and you're gonna find three watchers at the gates, and you need to know the names of the watchers. There are a series of veils surrounding the father of the treasury. There are 12 emanations. You should probably know the names of the 12 emanations. You should know the name of the true God. It's presented slightly differently. So the first book of Jeu, there's a big gap in the middle where there's a bunch of stuff missing. And the first part is laying out the maps of the treasury. So it's got these diagrams showing the positions. Here are where the three watchers are on the way in. Here where the three watchers are on the way out. Here are the boxes. They've got the name of the god in the middle, being surrounded by these boxes representing the veils. It's got the names of the emanations to one side, and then it goes through some number of those, and then there's a gap of a lot. And when it starts up again, it's going at the very end of the treasuries, sort of from the 50s down to the 60th. And that, instead of presenting a map, is giving the sort of ritual guidance on how to approach these treasuries. So instead of here's the character of the god, we're sort of representing his essence. Here's the seal that you need to seal yourself with to proceed here and say these names. Yes. So between the two, there's two different tacks that the author is taking. Here is the full map and information of what it all looks like, and here is the specific information you need to actually pass through.
Right, and I remember that Schmidt and I think GRS Mead disagree about this, and I think you come down on with Mead is that probably what existed originally were 60 maps and maybe 60 sets of instructions. So you had to have the map memorized, and you also needed to have the seal and the ciphers and all the pebbles you had to hold on to, and all that stuff. Is that right? Is I remember that correctly? Your position is that
Uh,
it seems like reasonable to me that there were 60 maps and 60 and sets of instructions.
we don't know, but that is what I would assume.
Yeah, that seems I don't know. I shouldn't be so presumptuous, but I was like, yeah, if you're gonna have 60 maps and you need 60 instruction sets, I don't know. Again, just my D&D video game, I don't know if folks ever played like the Adventures of Lolo, like the old 1980s Nintendo game. It's like where you're just like a little guy walking around and you have to solve all kinds of puzzles to go to the next layer of the castle. It just the Books of Jeu just like strike me as like the perfect 1980s Nintendo. You have to solve all these things like this. Also, I was wondering, just to get your thoughts on this, the nomina barbara, that we find in the text, the letter Z, the Z sound seems
Mhm,
to really be Z's and vowels. They really and the ps sound,
mhm.
also to a lesser degree. Any thinking as to why that Z sound seems so? And of course, I didn't do a statistical analysis of this, but I'm wondering if you notice the same thing, that the text seems to revel in the Z sound for a lot of these nomina barbara.
It does. I'm gonna straight up confess I do not know or have a theory of why the Z sound is prevalent, but it is definitely noticeable that a lot of these names feature the Z.
Yeah, the za. Yeah, I just was another thing I was noticing. I'd be again. This is grist for the mill of Dr. Kirsten Switzer, who wants to really build a database of all these nomina barbara, all these magical
Mhm.
signs, and really begin doing the hardcore statistical analysis to get some sense of what, you know, is the Z sound something we find in a lot of Greek magical papyri. They just like that sound for whatever reason.
That'd be really
Um,
good.
Being interesting, and also to compare it to Merkava texts, which also have long strings of names of
Yep.
divine beings, and seeing if there's similarities at the phonological level. It's just more interesting
I
stuff
mean,
to get at in these texts.
if I'm being 100% speculative, you could say, oh, well, the Z sound sort of produces a kind of a vibration sense in your mouth, in your bones, that if you're saying mystical names, maybe it sort of has a feel of power, but that is not backed up by anything.
Yeah, and again, I think it's totally reasonable to just to kind of speculate. We have to, and I think that one of the things to do about these texts is like, you know, these were meant to be said out loud. That's the ritual
Yep.
order. Is you're supposed to say them out loud, and even tells you how many
Mhm.
times to say them out loud.
It does.
And to be able to say them out loud, and we start to notice things like, oh yeah, my head is vibrating all the time when I'm doing this. We can only speculate, but
Hmm.
the Z sound made a Z sound back then too, probably to some degree, and we can at least say, oh yeah, this is interesting. I don't know. I agree with you, but we name it speculation, but at the same time, I think there's something about the forensic business of trying to say these things out loud and get a sense of what that was like. And I don't know. I find that to be an interesting thing. But yeah, this is another thing I was noticing as I was working through them. Um, in other characters, Zostrianos, we also get the Z sound.
Yep.
Um, Maybe it's just an exotic sound. Zoroaster was just sort of the exotic sound. We find something similar, by the way, in the Zohar, where the Zohar tends to want to make up words. It
Hmm.
tends to make up words using certain clusters of sounds that it likes. So maybe
Hmm.
it's just a human thing that we pick out sounds we find to be interesting or exotic and name our watchers that for whatever reason. Um, the character of you,
Hmm.
he's they I don't know what I don't know what their gender is. They probably are not gendered because they're beyond all that kind of stuff.
Well, I mean, there's still the father is
Right.
described at great length, but not for you. So I think that in my book, I probably gendered you as a he. I'm rethinking whether that's correct, but
Yeah, I have no idea. But it's just an interesting, question about what these beings are. But he seems they seem, and again, it's sort of interesting because he is the great emanator, and so in some sense, he could just as well be colored as kind of a mother deity as much as a father deity in terms of you know, all the emanation they're doing. Um, must be exhausting emanating all those things, but
it's a lot of emanating.
a lot of at least 60 of the treasuries. Um, any thoughts about this being? Right, he seems to be unique to this literature, or at least idiosyncratic to some significant degree to this literature.
Sure.
But unlike other, and my speculation maybe it was connected somehow to Yao, we a common being,
Hmm.
Although, as you pointed out in private correspondence, right, Yao also appears in another place in this, so they can't be the same thing, at least not strictly speaking. Um, but any sense of where, what this name might mean, what it might be connected to, where it might come from? Could it have an Egyptian origin? Any speculation at all about this peculiar being in many ways?
It is a peculiar being. I mean, the fact that he's basically charged with creating the universe. If you did want to speculate on a sort of Jewish background somewhere in there, a connection to Yahweh would not be unthinkable, but it's extremely far
Mhm.
removed, I think. Um, but certainly in terms of the sounds, uh, four characters, vowels coming together. It's not far from any of the sort of nomina barbara mystical names in that regard, but it's uh, short, pithy, and uh, easy to write and remember.
It's true. I mean, it could even be an abbreviation. I mean,
It
so
could be.
it could be an abbreviation. I mean, and this is another thing that folks should also know. The books of Yu delight in cryptograms. The text is populated by all kinds of cryptograms and other
Yes.
texts. So we can never, when you see a translation, you should be, tracking to, oh yeah, that's actually like a weird cryptogram or
It's actually a
uh,
symbol.
yeah, symbol, right? The word for treasury often is just sort of it's like an L-shaped symbol with two little ringlets, which again looks a lot like the kind of magical signs that you see in other Greco magical texts.
Hmm.
But yeah, it's always an interesting, in the Greek magical papyri, you often have a lot of these really long palindromic names for these various deities, and you can speculate all day long about what they are. But the character of Yu is very fascinating in that. Also, his relationship to Jesus. It's not clear. Like there's the unknowable, the unreachable, the unattainable Father, which
Yep.
okay, unattainable. But the relationship between you and Jesus seems very strange, where it seems like you is superior to Jesus in some ways, and yet sometimes it seems like Jesus is causing the Father to make you do all these emanations, or it's a very strange kind of trifecta in some ways. Maybe speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, it is sort of a trinity in a way, except that you, I think, gets kind of he creates the universe, but he's also kind of demoted to being in charge of the physical universe. In the fourth book of the Pistis Sophia, he's sort of out there wrangling the Aeons, sort
Mm.
of punishing the bad ones and keep putting the good ones in a place where they can be rewarded. And he's sort of charged with maintaining a lot of what's going on, whereas Jesus is, I think, closer to the uh, unattainable, ineffable God. But
And do you
so
and do you
use
think that's a change over time in terms of the development of the Julian cosmo-theology, that the books of you come earlier, the Pistis Sophia texts come later, and do you think that's a like it seems like in the if assuming the first introductions of the first book of you are not even part of it or tacked on later, then
Mhm.
Jesus plays very little role in the first book of
he
you,
he does
virtually none. And
virtually
it's
none.
and it seems like if we go later into the Pistis Sophia, which this episode
Hmm.
will not focus on the Pistis Sophia just because
Yeah.
we can only do so much and whatever. Um, there it seems like Jesus, like you said, is playing a much more prominent role in everything. And I wonder if that's because the Uins are paying or playing more into Christian hegemony, or their or their theology has changed, because clearly there's evidence of change throughout these texts that they're
Hmm.
adapting, and their cosmology certainly changes over time and things like that. Any sort of sense as to what might be going on? Or another way of putting this, right, is you make a really good and a really convincing claim, um, that the first book of you,
Hmm.
particularly, is very closely uh, related to Egyptian indigenous religion.
Hmm.
The system of the Watchers looks a lot like the book of the Coming Forth by Day, the Book of the Dead. The astral world looks very Egyptian. The final destiny of the soul is much more Egyptian in character. And I wonder if the earlier books might be closer to Egyptian priestly concerns And as the literature develops through time, it becomes much more in the orbit of Christianity, where it becomes much more heavily Christianized. Is that a reasonable or possible or
I
um,
think yes, I think that is probably right on the money. So what I view as the earliest stuff in terms of the first book of Jeu could you could more or less take the name of Jesus out and it wouldn't make a big difference. And I think what's notable is that throughout the texts, there's not a ton of what you would recognize as sort of um, mainstream Christian literary references. So a lot of what we do have is potentially from Matthew, but we know that they also have their beef with the Sethians, who would also have had access to that kind of book. So it's possible that they didn't even deal with the sort of mainstream Christian uh, schools or branches at all, and they were only dealing with the idea of this individual godlike being from these what we would view as less mainstream groups.
and if it's the case, and you make the argument that that you may actually be a solar deity in first you,
Mm-hmm.
with the astrological read, and that seems like the bark of the sun, and you know the that strikes me as very. At that point, it's like, is it you or is it Ra? Like it really could, you really could be. You could just as, I mean, not just more easily map on an Egyptian deity at that
Mm-hmm.
point. Um, sort of Osiris Ra kind of stuff, much more easily in many ways than Jesus. Um, so that was again a point well taken about the first book of you, and especially the way that you really show that the Egyptian stuff was really on the much more on the nose than one might think. So yeah, that's a fascinating parallel, and yeah, again, it's just the syncretisms that go on there in those texts. It's so hard to tell where something begins and ends, and I always say this in the channel that history just doesn't give a damn about our categories, and
Yeah,
what we call Christian, what we call Egyptian, what we call magic. They're just getting out of here. They're
sure,
reaching salvation, and for
that's
them,
right.
that's instrumental. That's
Yeah.
what's the core of what they're cared about. They're not cared about categories that we want to impose upon them.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe the lesson, or at least at part here, is to not expect them to play by our rules in the least bit.
That's very true. Even for example, the baptisms. You think what do you think of when you think of a baptism? Probably not what these rituals
Mhm.
described here are, where you're gathering bread and wine and a bunch of plants, maybe some stones, and standing in a circle and reciting a prayer. There's no water involved other than changing wine into water.
Yeah, and that's the thing and I won't be covering so much the baptisms in this episode because I've covered them in a
Yes.
separate episode. But even that strikes me as kind of like, yeah, they're leaning on the Gospel of Matthew, but they're also kind of putting their thumb in the
Oh
Christian's
yeah.
eye, because
It's
it's
like.
the wine turns into water.
Mm-hmm.
Like they're like, yeah, like yeah, you have your Jesus, but we have the wine's an intoxicant, and that's bad maybe, but we have it really, it's about purification, and drunkenness is about not being pure, and so our Jesus does you one better than your wedding of Cana Jesus. I mean, again, I don't know if that's what the author has in mind there, but no one, I think, in reading these texts or knowing these texts in the second, third centuries, the water into wine bit was pretty famous pretty early on,
Yeah.
and it's unignorable the fact that the Gnostic, the Uinn baptism flips it. That just
Yes.
strikes me as, I think any proto-Orthodox Christian would spit out their coffee when they read that part.
Yes. And it's very clearly stated that the wine that you source has to come from a pure person.
Mhm.
So even though it's an intoxicant, you have to consider the source.
Right, and it's curious what I mean, we sometimes have pure papyrus mentioned in Greek magical text. The language of purity is kind of quasi Jewish, but also Egyptian. The Egyptians also had very strict rules about what was constitutive of purity, and the way the Christians didn't. They didn't talk in purity language so much in the same
Mhm.
way. Um, for them, what came out of you was what was pure, not what went in.
Mhm.
And so it's an interesting kind of language in that way. Um, yeah, I want to revisit my baptism episode to make sure I didn't make a ton of blunders, which I'm sure I did. But I need
Not
to,
at all.
if you say so. But I again, that was an instance where I wanted to do the book of you, got
Hmm.
cold feet. I was like, I'll just do the baptisms instead. Completely got cold feet, and I was like, can't do this. I'm too scared. I'm gonna blunder this whole thing up. So I'll just focus on 3 pages of baptisms and make an episode about that and move on, as if nothing happened. And it's funny because no one has ever said like, "Are you going to cover the whole book at some point?" Um, which is like good for me because I was able to hide in the bushes so that no one noticed. But I was like, no, I need to do it,
Well,
and being able to chat with you was a huge part of me getting up a little bit of the bravery to be able to take on the text.
I appreciate that. I mean, the baptisms are definitely one of the most easily sort of discussable bits, in that there are concrete parts to these rituals. There's stages. You can sort of follow. You can make judgments about the ingredients that are involved, and the references to the different types of baptisms. Um, the the first book of you with lots and lots of treasury instructions. It's very repetitive,
Mm-hmm.
um, but it's also very broken in terms of what's available. So making any like overarching judgments from, okay, well, we look at the name at the beginning of the treasuries and the name at the end, and you can follow this path that we've taken. You can't do that because
It's
over 50%
broken.
of them are gone.
Right, right, right. And even the sections at the very beginning where you is kind of emanating the
Voices.
voices and
Mhm.
the little idea, which that's a very strange concept, the concept of little idea, whatever that is
Yes.
exactly. Um, even those early illustrations, and this is another thing I want to ask you about the illustrations in a moment. Um, even those are very difficult to try to tease out what the circles and the lines might represent, and do
Hmm.
the voices, which are the linear aspects, become the walls of the more linear aspects of the treasuries, and the circles are, yeah, it becomes so difficult to tease out what's going on, um, because you're, again, we're kind of getting them one, maybe telephone, um,
Yes.
and also Schmidt's reproduction of them is more stylized than they are in the, and you point out, right, that he makes certain kinds of mistakes. I'm not sure is the right word, but he doesn't represent them completely accurately.
They're not exactly copied
Right.
uh, line for
A-
line.
And also the even if you go online, they're all scanned now. You can see them all in the online, but you're also seeing them badly damaged through tracing
Yes.
paper.
Yeah.
Um, so even trying to see them in the original manuscript, even with ultraviolet light. And I've heard that in maybe the 19th century there were some photographs of them made that were better, but
They're,
I've never been able to track down those negatives to see the
those
manuscript in those.
those are the ones that I used in the book.
Oh,
Um,
that's why they're so much higher
so
quality.
that's why the drawings are a little bit clearer. They've faded a lot.
Hmm.
And I mean, it's worth noting that so they were they were purchased in the 1790s. Whatever, somebody did an initial uh, copy into Latin, I think, but it was a bunch of loose leaves.
Hmm.
In the process between that first transcription and the next time somebody looked at it, like 7 or 8 leaves were
Yeah.
gone. They were turned around. Nobody knew what order they were in, so some scholars put together a completely different order that didn't entirely make sense. So there was a lot of detective work in just trying to figure out what order do the pages go in when there's no page numbers, and it's clearly a bunch of different books. Um, yeah,
Yeah.
it was a challenge from the very beginning. It's
It
not
was a
just
mess.
now.
It was a, yeah, and yeah, like, and folks don't, it was even bound, like folio and rectos were reversed, pages were
Yep,
upside down.
yep,
It really was a mess. And also, like, this is what happens when you take a book in the 18th century from bone dry Egypt and take it to humid Victorian England, and
yep,
it begins to get mildew and dissolves, which
yeah.
is yeah, lots of conservation, lots of things for conservators to learn about what to do and what not to do. I mean, as much as they knew anything in the 19th century, when you get a book like this. Um, just to focus in a little bit on the illustrations, which again, I really want to focus on this. This is a thing that just blows my mind. This is the only illustrated Gnostic text that we have from antiquity. Like,
Hmm.
the fact that people just didn't study it, just for that we actually have illustrations that outline what a lot of this stuff looks like. Um, what's interesting is that I think Pistis Sophia doesn't have much in the way of
It does not.
illustrations. Although it assumes that you've done a lot of the work in the Books of Jeu, probably it assumes that you've already it
I view it as it views it as you are working up to being able to access
right.
this material. So the Pistis Sophia is more of a mythic text. It's sort of getting new people sort of introduced to the idea of this is how the world is and this is how you should live. Whereas the Books of Jeu are more solid ritual manual, like you've lived in the appropriate way for the 12 years or whatever, and you are ready to undergo the steps of the baptismal purification rites. Um, for the second Book of Jeu, maybe it's just even an officiant who has it and is just referring to it while he's preparing the rituals and then walking you through the Aeonic ascent.
Right, and I think you mentioned that, right? Is that this may be the case that even these rituals may have not been performed probably were not performed all at once. That
Yeah.
you receive different baptisms at different stages of your initiation and purification, and so I tend to agree with you that the second Book of Jeu was probably for an initiator to use.
Yeah.
Um, Whereas the first book could have been something that people could have memorized. It could have been
Sure.
a textbook, basically,
Yes.
for and again, very much in the way that the Book of the Dead or the Book of Coming Forth That
Mm-hmm.
Day was kind of like you carried it with you because you were
Mm-hmm.
going on a journey and you needed to guide you to where you were going at some level, and that the same way the Book of You, the first book at least, could have really been something that I could see someone being buried with, right? That you took it with you, and it was like the dungeon master's guy, it was the map of the dungeon, and you used it to navigate your way through the heavenly spheres to get to where you were going. In a lot of these texts, we don't know where the Bruce Codex was found or the Askew Codex. We don't even know how the hell it ended up in England. Um, probably Nagamati was in a grave. So I suspect all these texts were probably the result of tomb robbing at some point. And
Mm.
so it just would not strike me as very shocking if the Books of You were buried with someone and were actually meant to be post-mortem. They function in a similar way to the Book of Coming Forth by Day. That would not at all surprise me. Um, so again, more speculation on my part, but I would not be surprised if the Books of You were buried with a Uin, maybe even like a high level Uin,
Mm-hmm.
or something like that. Oh, another thing I was going to ask real fast. Um, have you heard any dating on the Bruce Codex? Is there a sense? I've seen dates that go from third, fourth century to ninth century, and it
I
sounds bizarre. The Bruce Codex, and I've heard they're not, they've not carbon dated it because of its way it's conserved. They
mm-hmm.
don't want to open it up from the tracing paper things because it may just dissolve.
Yeah.
But have you heard any sense, and I didn't see it in your book, and I may have just missed it, and I didn't see it in the McDermott, but any sort of dating, either codicologically or otherwise, on the actual Bruce Codex itself.
Yeah. So there's not a lot of concrete information. I think the scholarly consensus has basically been probably somewhere early fourth or even maybe early fifth century for this copy of the book. The original text itself, earlier, maybe early third century. Yeah, I think your other guest made a reference to the Books of Jeu as being from the 5th or 6th century. I'm not sure where that number came from. And certainly one of the earlier scholars made a reference to the 9th or 10th century, but that was a much earlier scholar who I think was viewing it as just decadent hogwash and must have been so far down the line, so far removed from its original spiritual context that.
Right. Yeah, I think that's what that was sort of my, again, I'm not a papyrologist or whatever, but the script looks like the kind of script you see in Nagamati, which
Yeah.
is interesting that they're basically contemporaneous, codicologically, and not terribly far from each other. Medinet Habu is not, assuming it came from there where he got it, and they wouldn't be terribly far afield of one another. But
well, if we know that the Uins were encountering the Sethians and people who were using the Apocryphon of John, that's not wild to consider.
Yeah. And the untitled text is also in Sahidic. I think that You is also Sahidic. So, but again, it's also just amazing to think that this text, probably translated from Greek,
Yep.
is making its way up the Nile, and where it comes to rest at Medinet Habu. it's really in the, it's pretty far away from the cosmopolitan world of Alexandria, where you would think a lot of these debates are happening. But
Mhm.
again, it just shows you that this is probably going on in a much bigger way than we probably realize up and down the Nile, that there are communities all up and down the Nile, um, that are going in. Again, with the Apocryphon of John, it's really neat to see the fact that it's been translated several times into Coptic,
Sure.
which is also just, again, showing you that there are lots of communities, some of which don't even have copies that the other communities have.
Mhm.
Um, any speculation or thoughts on the illustrations? I know this is a really big question, and I'll be talking a little bit with Dr. Kirsten Switzer about this, who's really, her expertise is in these magic signs.
Mhm.
But from your working on it, did you see any patterns or any sort of any kind of telltale things, like we noticed on the sign for the 60th Treasury, that it's divided into 12? I mean, kind of gives you Zodiac vibes. Um, any sort of things like that you notice that maybe key you in to maybe what some of these illustrations might have represented or might have meant, to the folks that compose these texts?
It's a very good question, um, and it is difficult to answer. I mean, so there's the different types of illustrations that are included. So there's the characters that are representing the Yeu deities of each individual treasuries, and then there's the seals, which are separate, and those are presumably meant to be sort of pressed on you or presented in some way versus um, an image of power of that god, which is sort of a separate thing. Uh, I mean, there's certainly motifs that are recognizable from other magical papyri, the magic signs and characters from those. You've got a lot of the sort of 8-pointed stars
Mhm.
uh, feature in several of the diagrams. Um, I am not an expert in the use of the sort of ancient ritual magic iconography. Uh, there was an interesting discussion. I think it was G.R.S. Mead who was speculating about the uh, portion at the beginning of the Books of Jeu where it's the voices going forth, and you
Mm.
have the diagrams, and it starts as all circles. Um, and then as the voices come forth, it sort of forms these squares around the circles, and he's speculating that the circular forms represent a spiritual nature, whereas the more right angles represent a more material nature that is coming to be as these entities are emanated. Uh, Read into that what you will.
And it seems reasonable to me that these are also folks who are interested in geometry, and geometry would have been a thing that educated people would have learned. And you get the image of circles and lines coming from each other, sort of the
Mm-hmm.
monad giving birth to the circle, and the equally giving birth to the circle and the line. And so
Mm-hmm.
you kind of get not just it's the emanation of geometry itself, at some level, which
Sure.
seems completely reasonable at some level. Um, and again, you point out the fact that many of these images seem to represent stars. That would be also, I think, grist for the mill of your argument that what we're dealing with at some level is the kind of astro theology, at least in the first book of Jeu, maybe, or you, that we're dealing with. Like it's a heaven looking, literally heaven looking,
It is
system.
it is a heaven looking system. I guess my only caution there would be the fact that that type of image is used in an awful lot of the sort of
Right.
magical papyri, uh, making the leap that it must be astral because it's a sort of a star shape. We don't have that
Right.
guarantee.
No,
They're
absolutely.
known sort of stylized images of power, or
Right.
and
Who knows? And I guess the other one that really strikes me as conspicuous, and you point this out in your book, is I think it's the uh, so after the baptisms, the signs change. There's a sign after, and a sign before, and a sign after, and
mm-hmm.
it's the sign after, I think, the baptism of the Holy Spirit, where it's the two hands raised
Oh yeah,
looking glyph that looks a bit like an Egyptian hieroglyph for the word for, I think it's for Ka, right, for soul,
yeah,
or one of
that's
them.
right.
So that's another. I think that's also a great, again, tying it back to its Egyptian roots, which would be very unsurprising that in a land dominated by imagery like that you're not also going to see some of those powerful images also make it into these texts. Um, yeah, so it's again, we'll get into more detail with Kirsten Switzer about those images, and I'll be curious to see if she what her insights are as well. Um, I know that you've been out of sort of the academic game for a little while, but you've written the book on it. I mean, you've written the book on this text, and one of the things I'm always curious about with scholars who've done these, super important monographs on these texts is, you set the stage in many ways for like the direction of where future scholarship is going to go at some level. If people are going to build on your work, or if people are going to work on this, they're going to have to build on your work, or they should, because that's the way scholarship should be done. Um, and I was wondering, when you finish this, your dissertation, you finish the book, um, and one of the big questions, I guess, when I finish a project is sort of, what are the untied ends? What are the other directions of scholarship that you would like to see done and on the sort of the Uins, assuming that, if you had if you could sort of program a graduate student to go forth and work on Uian stuff, what kind of work would you like to see done? I mean, for instance, I'm really interested in the relationship of Merkava literature to the Uian text, right? We have two different roughly contemporaneous forms of Ascent literature, although the Merkava people descend, but whatever. In fourth dimensional, it's all the same. Um, but in space, there's no up and down, whatever. And so that would be a place I would love to see someone take this, is sort of really getting into the weeds of the Merkava literature compared to this. But are there places where you would like to see this literature go? What kind of unfinished questions or other ideas would you want to see, avenues you'd like to see pursued on this literature?
Well, as you brought up, the one of the most interesting parts of the Books of Jeu are the diagrams and the images that are found throughout it. Um, I would love to see more in-depth scholarship on what they potentially represent, or where they originate beyond just sort of all other kind of magical symbol things, much like a lot of other things from the milieu. So being able to get more clarity on how those came about uh, would be very fascinating to me.
Yeah, I think that's, folks, people ask me all the time, hey, I'm a graduate student working in blah blah blah, I want a project. There you go.
Yeah, and also just the other thing you commented on, the magical names. Um, what kind of connections are there? Can you make anything of how these names were put together or chosen or derived?
Mhm.
The use of the sounds statistically, uh, how the letters are used, and what combinations with what vowels, and if there are any sort of um, morphological features that might explain why those were chosen.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating. And again, this is a thing that I've talked to several people about. It's just computational analysis of this literature is just a thing that we need to do, because one of the things that previous generations of scholars, one of the big mistakes they made was just, oh, it's nonsense. And even in the McDermott edition, they don't even write out, they don't even transcribe the names of the emanations
No.
or the various kind of names. They just dot it all out as if it's just of no consequence.
Yeah.
Um, and I mean, it's a huge consequence, because it was a consequence to the people that wrote these books. It
It's
was the
half
key
the
to all of
text.
it. Yeah, it's like it was the most important part of the whole thing. Everything else is just window dressing for these parts, and it's hilarious that the window dressing gets all this critical apparatus, but the
Hmm.
actual part that the people who wrote this thought was the most important part. Dot dot dot. It boggles my mind a little bit.
Well, in a way, maybe that is for the best, because then by preserving the alphabet it was written in, you have to sort of cast your eye over and try to get the uh, closer pronunciation rather than an English uh,
It's true.
transliteration. But it's
Right.
not helpful for the layperson that just wants to read it and uh, get absorbed.
Yeah, and also I guess also that font that it's printed in. It's that more ecclesiastical Bohairic style font, as opposed
Hmm.
to the Sahit. The way that the actual manuscript's written is written in a much less chunky sort of script. I don't know. I like the more linear Coptic font just for reading. The more Boharic looking font that's more ecclesiastical to me is much more difficult for
Mhm.
me to read, at least. I don't know. Maybe I'm just being picky about my fonts. As a calligrapher, I get my it raises my font hackles. But um, well, I really just want to, again, one of the things that I love to do is I love to read scholars, and I love to be able to do the thing that I think is one of the most important things to do for scholarship is to thank scholars. So I just want to thank you. This is a book. These are books that cried out for solid analysis. I'm grateful for people like you that go against academic fashion and go the places where the academic stuff needs to go and really look at these difficult texts. And for folks who've read this or will study it after they watch the Esoterica episode, which between our conversations and in the episode, I hope you do go read it, because it is a neat book and it is worthy of your attention. But I just want to extend a real deep thanks for taking the time to chat with me and my audience and Esoterica folks, but also for the scholarship that you performed on um, making this amazing piece of Gnosticism accessible to people, and really providing a really deep analysis of it. I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for having me on and for tracking me down despite my current non-academic status. I'm really grateful that uh, you've read the book and you like the book and it's being useful to somebody. Uh, that's one thing as an academic, people will often tell you that why are you doing this? But it's
It,
really to put something out there and hope it makes a difference and inspires somebody.
yeah, I hope so. And these Esoterica, we're getting large enough now that tens of thousands of people get access to this material that otherwise I think wouldn't have access to. And your scholarship is part of bridging the gap between a very obscure, very difficult text and making it accessible. So um, yeah, I can appreciate that. And then also, I really forgive me for reaching out of the ether. I found you on your voice acting work, which is a totally different kind of line of work. And I was like,
Yes.
what are the odds of the same person being in Scotland with the same name? Maybe it's the same person, but now they have a hyphenated name. I think my message is like, you don't happen to be the person that wrote this book on these weird Jeuian people, do you? Uh,
Yeah.
and and
I
I'm
mean,
glad.
that 99% of the messages I get through that website are just spam. And I saw that one and said, oh, why, yes, I am.
And again, this is the world where I'm really glad that you just decided to reach back to some rando person writing you about a book that you wrote. I'm glad that you did, and I really appreciate that you took the time out of your day to have a conversation with me about this text. It's kind of a warm up for the episode that'll be coming out on Friday, God willing, that I finish scripting it. I got to get back to that. I'm about three-fourths of the way through the first book, which I feel like that's the hardest part, in my opinion, at least for me writing it. Is
Mm,
the second book the second book is a little easier to summarize, especially considering that I've already done a lot of the baptismal work in a separate episode. So
sure.
um, uh, I'm about three-fourths of the way through the first book, and I feel like cross that hurdle, and it will be downhill from there. We'll see. We'll
Got
see.
some good hymnal stuff to come to.
That's true. Yeah, the beautiful. Yeah, the great hymns at the end, and um, which I really feel like it's a pity that we most of those are also just fragmentary. Like that's the lifeblood of this community at some level. Like we can't quite hear them sing, but this is maybe what they would have sung when they, who knows? We don't know, and it's a pity that you know. It's a danger. It's always a danger to project back.
Mhm.
But I always think about the hymnal. Most religious people, they see their prayer book or their hymnal far more than they ever see a Bible or another piece of religious literature. Most average
Mm,
Christians are going to see a hymnal far more than they're ever going to see a Bible. Most Jews see a prayer book far more than they're going to see the Talmud or whatever. And it's the hymns. The hymns, music brings people together. And when those are fragmentary and lost, I feel like that's actually the
mm,
biggest loss for an actual glimpse potentially into the daily life of those folks. So
yeah.
it's good stuff. Well, I won't keep you any longer. I really again appreciate the time you've taken to chat with me, and yeah, hopefully maybe I don't know. I'm not gonna put you on the spot, but when I get to the bravery up to do Pistis Sophia, maybe maybe I'll reach out to bother you again, but I'm not gonna put you on the spot for any commitments. But wonderful talking to you,
I
and
appreciate it.
everybody. Yeah,
Oh,
please.
feel free to reach out if you have any questions.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. All right, folks. Well, I'll see you folks Friday for the Books of Jeu, which again, if you're a fan of Gnosticism, kind of early Greco-Egyptian magic and mystical Ascent literature, all rolled into one, really will be. I think it really will be your jam. So I hope folks can catch me then. And thank you so much again, and have a great day.
You too.